I'd like to welcome Jan Godsell, Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Strategy at WMG, which is based at the University of Warwick. That's Warwick Manufacturing Group. We had an interesting conversation last year around supply chain and had various discussions about sustainability. And we wanted to just pick up on that and see what's changed since we spoke last year, and what effect current circumstances have had on supply chain and related research. So if I can just welcome Jan, thanks for joining us again.
It's my pleasure.
So since we spoke last year, Jan, how have the challenges that researchers face in the field of supply chain changed? Has anything become more difficult?
So actually, I think it's almost the opposite. I suppose every cloud has a silver lining, and whilst it's truly disastrous for the world in many, many ways, the COVID-19 pandemic, actually what it's brought into sharp focus is the importance of our supply chains and the importance of actually having resilient supply chains that can ensure that those items that are critical to life get to us. But also, I think with many parts of the world being in lockdown and us seeing a significant reduction in CO2 emissions, as we've perhaps limited both our own personal travel but also industrial activity, I think there is definitely another voice saying, can we somehow try to sustain these lower levels of CO2 and the positive benefits for the environment the lockdown has had? And so what I'm seeing, particularly at a policy level, and I'm sure that this will trickle down through the research agendas too, is a greater realisation that perhaps moving forward, it is really important to focus on things like productivity, but equally sustainability, which was beginning to really gather momentum, particularly around targets around net zero, are now complemented by other impact targets such as resilience, and also well-being, because I think home working brought that into sharp contrast. But at the core of this is the word supply chain being used in a way that historically it's never been used before. And I think that's a real opportunity for scholars of operations and supply chain strategy to really grasp.
Yeah. And do you think, when we spoke last time, Jan, there was some disparity in terms of people's interpretation of sustainability and sustainable supply chain? Do you think there's a more sort of general understanding of that now? Do you think everybody means the same thing when they're talking about that?
So I still think there's probably a lack of consensual definition. The word supply chains had that lack of definition for about 30 years. So I think with sustainability, it's not going to necessarily resolve itself overnight. I think it also gets confused because there's a lot of competing terminology, such as circular economy, net zero, sustainability, different aspects of sustainability. So I think it gets quite cluttered. And I think particularly industrialists are looking for a clearer pathway through of that. Yeah. But what I would say, I think actually what COVID-19's helped to do is to actually put the end-to-end nature of supply chains into better focus. So I think we better understand the scope of what we're trying to achieve, even if we're not necessarily sure specifically what that means in terms of output measures or how we measure that.
So do you think, in that sense, do you think that research is going to be more collaborative?
So interestingly, as we've been organising the special sessions, for instance, just around COVID-19 or response to COVID-19, I think we're still seeing within the ops community those that perhaps see something happening as an opportunity to do research, where really they're still looking to improve the theory base. And there's others that see what's happened as a set of problems that the ops and supply chain management community can get behind to solve. And I think the same sits for sustainability. And, you know, I think the benefit of academic scholarship is that we can do both. And I think that we need to do both. But I think the number of people that are perhaps wanting to grapple with a more problem-centered approach, an approach that's perhaps more likely to more directly bring about societal change through engaged scholarship is perhaps increasing, but it's equally important to still understand the theory base and make the connection between the two.
Mm-hmm. And what sort of societal change do you think the research can drive?
So I do wonder whether, and I really like to go back to United Nations Global Sustainability Development Goals, and the one that particularly interests me is Goal 12, which is about responsible consumption and production. Yeah. And I think therefore that suggests that we can't look at ops and supply chain, which is the sort of production side, in isolation, that actually it's that interconnectivity into responsible consumption. And actually, if you look back over the history of our industrial evolutions, then actually, some of the motivator around people like Henry Ford was that he drove forward to develop a production line that could make cars more cheaply, because he wanted to make them more cheaply so that people could afford to buy them. Because if people could afford to buy them, then the system would continue. So I think consumption and production have always been inextricably linked. And actually going forward, I think we may need to move to more truly transdisciplinary approaches to try to tackle some of these problems rather than looking at them within our sort of functional silos.
Mm-hmm. So where do you think the priorities lie in the research?
So again, the great thing about being an academic is that we can choose, in some respects, our own priority.
Yeah.
And in that way, we get a better spread. From my own personal perspective, I actually think that a greater understanding, so for me, a priority would be a better understanding about the way in which we can influence either consumer demand or company demand, because at the end of the day, if we can change demand for products to be demand for products that are more sustainable, then actually that drives the whole production chain to actually produce more sustainable products. And it's not just about sustainability in terms of our planet, but I think the other really important aspect to bring in is actually the people side, and perhaps it's even beyond just being sustainable to be being responsible as well. Now, what I think that will drive, or what that's going to be supported by, is research that looks at how we make our supply chains more visible, because it's going to be visibility of what's going on that perhaps will educate people to make different choices.
Yeah.
And actually, this brings us back to an age-old problem that we've seen within supply chains, which is poor supply chain integration. It's one of those topics that goes around and around and around. We've not been able to necessarily resolve because we still see our organisations suffering from silo thinking. Mm-hmm. So I do wonder whether the advent of some new technologies that can perhaps make things more visible, combined perhaps with some of the sort of considerations around things like behavioural economics, we might be able to nudge people into making different choices, or actually use artificial intelligence or other forms of data analysis to actually make those decisions for us and take the human out of the equation. So there's lots to go at.
So when we were talking last time, you mentioned that one of the challenges that academics face is getting hold of the data that's needed to sort of back up the research from industry. Do you think that industry is going to be more open with that data to help solve some of these problems?
Again, I think lessons learned from COVID, there's been some examples where supply chains have been able to reconfigure really quickly, and there's some really great examples of leading practice. And I think companies have been more willing to share or to collaborate, because they understand how important that learning is, not just for their own organisation, but actually potentially to protect a national capability. So I think if we move quickly, we can perhaps take some of the spillover effect from that goodwill and an understanding that, yes, it's really important for individual organisations to have competitive advantage. But actually, there's some things here where we're contributing to either a greater national or global good, And if there's ways to be able to extract that good practice out in a way that doesn't erode their competitive advantage, then actually that's the right thing to do.
Yeah. So what do you think is needed beyond the research? So to take it from the research to actually having an impact? Are there different ways in which the information can be presented to different stakeholders that's more likely to get them engaged in the process and change behaviour?
As you know, I've always been a great fan of your the Emerald Impact process. Actually, last year, as part of an Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund project called Transform Construction, we did a systematic lit review of all the frameworks that were out there, and actually developed a combined view of how you develop impact, because different frameworks focused on slightly different things. And we'd found through working with the Transform Construction project, this got a little bit confusing. So actually, I think the view that I'm taking now is that almost when you start on any project, you should start by creating an impact map. And those impacts at the far end really are those big things around how does it link to productivity, how does it link to resilience, how does it link to sustainability, well-being, competitiveness, and those longer term impacts are probably the same for just about every project. Now, the issue with those long-term impacts is they're not specifically measurable, and they create more of a vision of where you're heading. As you work back through the map and then think about your outcomes, both short and long term, how you might achieve that, and then a step back in terms of what are your specific outputs, I think that's a really powerful process. And then probably from the other end, you start thinking about the specific research activities that you're going to do. Then you can think about your stakeholders, and then you can link the different outputs to the different stakeholders. I mean, personally, as a minimum, for just about every piece of research we do, we would always think about hosting some kind of webinar or discovery day. We would always look to create some kind of practitioner report. And obviously, we'd look to academic journal papers. But more often than not now too, we also try to develop simple online diagnostic tools, which can then be used by many, many different people. And we're very open-minded about those tools. So for instance, we've just our Industry 4 readiness tool, which did become part of an advisory note for a British standard. We were approached by a Dutch university that wanted to adapt it for Dutch SMEs. And so we shared the cost of them translating it into Dutch, so that they could use the tool, because actually it's in that way that you get impact.
Okay, that's great. That's really interesting. Thanks for that. You mentioned the fact that you think that research will be more truly transdisciplinary. And I'm wondering, is that going to affect the funding that's available? Do you think, the current circumstances that we're in, has funding been affected? Is that going to be a new challenge?
So from my knowledge of in the UK, I can't speak for other countries. I think UKRI is recognising the importance, particularly of bringing together our two dominant historic research councils, the one that looked at more physical science and the one that looked more at social sciences, the EPSRC and the ESRC. And I think they actually recognise that where we have significant problems, there's a real benefit for trying to bring together researchers from quite different backgrounds, and perhaps using mini sandpit type events or other types of workshops to be able to think about how you could create not work streams within a program that are multidisciplinary, but actually try to craft a program from the onset that is truly transdisciplinary, and getting that interplay of views from different disciplines. I think it's early days, but we're definitely seeing an ambition more towards that way of looking. And for instance, within the UK, there's an Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund project called Manufacturing Made Smarter, which is about the UK's digital strategy. And there's funding bodies, both very applied through Innovate UK, but through the EPSRC, they're going to develop some more technical research centres. But whereas in the past there may not have been, there's also, I believe, going to be an ESRC or a social science research centre too, that would sit above that to try to be the glue that holds it all together.
Okay, and that's, yeah, interesting. Well, we'll see how that develops, and this time next year we'll be able to pick up and see exactly what happened. So it's difficult to look into the future at the moment, isn't it? Because it's such a different environment that we are in. But I wonder if I can ask you to sort of take a stab and say, what does supply chain look like in 2030? How different do you think it will be?
I was very lucky. Yesterday I was having a discussion with the Chief Technology Officer from Ocado, and it was really reassuring because I found another future visionist sometimes. Because I actually believe, so if I look from a UK perspective again, I think this could apply for many developed countries, particularly in the UK. If we look at manufacturing, we've not been competitive, and so therefore we've seen perhaps a lot of our manufacturing capability move to other parts of the world, which is good because actually part of what we want to do is support globalization and global supply chain network design. But things like COVID-19 have perhaps shown some of the vulnerabilities that raises, particularly for items that are critical to life. Now, if we take into account the key trends, the things that are changing, I think massively driven by this greater awareness around sustainability, we are looking at different business models. Some of those business models are where we might, rather than keep making new stuff, which isn't necessarily always necessary, we can share it, or we can try to keep the stuff we've already got in its highest possible value state for as long as possible, which is driving us more to different types of servitized business models. But of course, they're only possible because we have better connectivity and IoT type technology that can support that. But of course, if we're going to start maintaining things, or if we're going to share things, then actually we require more local infrastructure and more local manufacturing. So I see the future actually as being very different. I see logistics and manufacturing are going to come together to create one network. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to be what I describe as a distributed manufacturing supply chain, where every machine or every vehicle is a node in that network that's connected, and that those networks will form dynamically in response to a consumer's or a company's specific request, and that consumer to some extent can choose which network configuration they prefer for their product based on trade-offs between the environmental, social, economic impact and possibly lead time. And this will see a huge shift away from economies of scale to equipment that can cope with economies of scope. It's going to see us move away from big batches towards this Industry 4 vision of a batch size of 1. It's going to see us from a very factory-centered or centralized view to a very decentralized view. I think it's also going to see us take much greater consideration of how the energy is made. So we could see a much greater consideration of low carbon energy sources and more distributed sources of low carbon energy. And we will see much, much greater consideration of how we make the trade-offs between environmental, social and economic impact visible to the end consumer. Maybe not by 2030, but we should be on our way by then. Yeah. But I think now perhaps is a time to, yes, we need to do the incremental improvements to make today's supply chains better. But I think now is also the time to think about how could the future be radically different.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you very much indeed, Jan. That was really interesting. And it'll be interesting to monitor that as we go forward and see what changes are contributing to that. So thank you very much. Good luck with your Euroma conference later this month. And we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you.